I'm Kathleen Henderson from Roots and Boots, and I want to take you on a quick tour of my Zone 7A garden in mid to late August. Before we actually go into the garden, I thought I would show you this arch here over the garden gate. It's slowly being filled in by my loofah vines. There you can see the whole arch, and I'll take you in close to show you a loofah gourd. Starting on this side of the garden, you might remember that I had cucumbers and watermelons planted on this perimeter. Neither of them did great. I think I might give up trying to grow watermelons because they never do well for me. And my cucumbers were just annihilated by cucumber beetles. I got maybe 1 or 2 good harvests, and then that was it. They're kind of on their way out. I decided to use the space especially where the watermelon was supposed to be, and it never took off, and I planted green beans along that perimeter. In fact, I think it's time to do our first green bean harvest. My broccoli was growing here. We pulled it out and planted beans for the late summer fall garden. I've got green beans growing on this far side, and right here behind me is another kind of bean, a new kind of bean that I've never grown that I'm hoping to use as dried beans. Moving over to this first trellis, these first 2 trellises is where I planted squash. The squash did so-so, as you might remember from some of my other videos. Some of it has already been pulled out, some of it is still growing, some of it is more of like fall and winter type squash, and some of it I reseeded, and I've got some baby to mid-sized squash plants growing, and I'm curious to see if they are able to withstand the squash vine borer, which is the main, most damaging pest that we face here. And I'm curious to see if these plants have enough time in our growing season to bear and mature some fruit. So we'll see. It's always an experiment. Here along this trellis where I had squash planted, a lot of the squash had to be pulled out because of the vine borer problems, so I took advantage of those empty spots to plant some peas for my fall garden. Next up is my 2 trellised rows of tomatoes here. This first row is Amish paste tomatoes, and the second row is a lot of cherries and some other heirlooms like purple Cherokee and Brandywine and pineapple, which are some of my favorites for fresh eating and for slicing. Because I grow indeterminate varieties, the indeterminate tomatoes produce a few tomatoes over a long period of time. So these tomatoes will be growing and ripening all the way up until our first frost. They keep producing until the frost kills the plants. After the tomatoes, I have my row of carrots. We've already harvested the first 2 rows. I planted 4 very close together, and the next 2 rows will be coming out in the near future. And then over here is where we had onions planted. We have harvested our onions. They are curing in one of the barns, and I have replaced them just yesterday with Brussels sprouts. It's my first time to grow Brussels sprouts, so that feels like a little bit of an experiment. I am really curious to see how they do. What I like to do when I'm growing something new is just not have very high expectations for it. The first year is always a total experiment, and if I get a harvest from it, then I consider that an added bonus. But mostly I'm trying to learn about the plant. How did this timing work for it, as far as when I started the seeds and when I planted it in the ground, and in relation to the frost. Brussels sprouts are best grown as a fall crop in most climates because they require a long growing season, and they taste better after the weather gets cold and even after you have some light frost. And depending on the climate where you live, you might even be able to grow them through the winter. So I'm so excited to experiment with this. I'm hoping to get some Brussels sprouts, but again, purely experimental. I'll see how it goes, and then I'll make adjustments and keep fine-tuning every year until I get good at growing them. Walking down towards the end of the garden, I'll show you what's growing. Down there I have more tomatoes, and then the new hugelkultur beds that we added. I talked about those in a separate video if you're curious, and especially if you're gardening in clay soil, I highly recommend you check those out. So these 2 rows here are more tomatoes. This one right here close to me is more cherries. Black cherry is one of my favorite types of cherry tomatoes, and then I have some yellow pear also. And then here on the second row I have more Amish paste because they are my favorite type of tomato for canning, and I do a lot of canning of different tomato products. In fact, if you're looking for good recipes for preserving tomatoes, turning them into food for your family to enjoy all year round, then you'll definitely want to check out the link below this video for my ebook about preserving tomatoes. It has some of my favorite tomato preserving recipes and some tips and tricks that you won't want to miss. Okay, coming around the corner here from the tomato overflow section, we have more green beans, and again, I think it's about time for our first green bean harvest. And then back here are the hugel beds. Let's go take a look at those. We put in these 4 hugel beds just this year in an effort to combat our heavy clay soil that we deal with here in Northern Virginia. We didn't put these in at the beginning of the growing season. It took us, they were probably finished like partway through the summer. So I'm focusing them primarily on our fall garden. We've got more green beans down here. I'm growing some fall carrots, and I have even more tomato overflow here. And then there's a new kind of bean that we're growing on these arches. It's a runner bean, it likes to climb, and I'd like to use it as a shelling bean, a dried bean. So that will be fun to experiment this year. So that is my late summer, early fall garden here in Northern Virginia, Zone 7A.